thank you very much for everyone for attending. My name is David Hull. I, along with Terry Hanford, are the program co-chairs for Focus Camera Club this year. Before I introduce tonight's guest, there are a few things that I need to address. The first is I would like to welcome our guests that are joining us for this program. I know that Geneva Dempsey I was on. If you want to say anything, Geneva, it's up to you. I know you were here 2 weeks ago and told us a little bit about yourself, but so you have the option. You can say hello and then we'll move on. But
hello, I'm
Okay.
glad to be
All
here
right.
and excited to hear what you guys present tonight.
Very good. Thank you very much for joining us again, Geneva. So we have two guests in this room. The first is Bud Gates, and I'm going to actually migrate over to be closer to Bud. And then the second is Jason Vick. And so I'll let them say a little bit about themselves and we'll play a little bit of back and forth. So I'll migrate over to Bud first and then to Jason second. Hello, Bud. How are you doing tonight?
Fine, thank you.
Thanks for joining us a little bit. So
Sure,
can you
yeah.
tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I live in Littleton and have been retired for quite a while. Started doing some photography in high school, and I'm pretty old now, so that's been a long time.
A lot of us resemble that.
Yeah, yeah, I see that. Thank you, bud. I'm among company. So anyway, I have a summer place about 10 miles out of Yellowstone National Park. So I have a lot of opportunity for wildlife and landscape photography, and that's what I do primarily.
Okay, very good.
So
how did you find Focus?
I think I saw it on the internet.
Good. Okay, that seems to be a very common avenue for
Right.
guests.
Yeah. And
what are you looking for in a camera club?
in a club?
Yeah.
Well, exchange ideas and see other people's work.
Good. Okay. A little bit of
And
camaraderie.
yeah, and try to learn something besides on YouTube TV or YouTube, which is a pretty good source.
Well, as I mentioned to you before, we'd like to have you attend in 2 weeks at our competition. So you're more than welcome to come back and join us.
Okay, thank you.
And I promise nobody will put you on the spot next time.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet
you bet.
And the second person is Jason Vick.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to come in and join the group tonight. I certainly appreciate it. I've been shooting my whole life as well, predominantly landscape and wildlife photography. I shoot a combination of Pentax gear, and I was lucky enough to get into some medium format Hasselblad gear a few years ago. So I've been really focusing on the, no pun intended, medium format work. And I split my time between Conifer and Breckenridge. So
Nice.
yeah.
Okay.
In terms of how I found you, there were like 3 clubs that popped up in the Denver metro area that looked appealing to me. So this is the first of the 3 that I'm visiting. In terms of what I'm looking for, just friends to go shooting with. I mean, we've got Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah around us. It doesn't get much better, in my opinion.
Well, welcome. Thanks for joining
you.
us. And like I mentioned about you earlier, please join us again for a couple of weeks because it's an open competition next
Okay.
time. And so you'll be able to preview some of our entries.
Excellent.
Nice to meet you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining, and you as well, Bud. Thank you. So that takes care of guests unless anyone has joined on Zoom. Nobody has joined here at Lone Tree. See if I can clip in and speak up. That's the first order of business as guests. The second is basically just to announce that in 2 weeks, we have our next meeting is October the 26th, which is our competition meeting. And that is with an open topic. So anything goes. So the title of tonight's program is Capturing Sharp Detail with Telephoto Lenses. This talk presents guidelines and techniques to achieve sharp detail when shooting with telephoto lenses. It explores shutter speed, focus, and ISO during image capture, and also equipment selection and preparation before the shoot. You might be surprised to learn that some of the conclusions drawn are counterintuitive. Our speaker tonight is Owen Newnan. Owen lives in the West Metropolitan Denver area and is joining us tonight from California. He's a retired software architect who got started with film photography back in 1960 when he inherited a collapsible Leica camera from his grandfather. He set up his own darkroom during college days and pursued nature photography. Once married, however, he found little time for photography other than to take snapshots of his family. With the advent of high quality digital photography, his son off to college and then retirement, he once again took up his hobby in earnest. So I think his story sounds very familiar to a large number of us in the club. So we relate to what you went through, Owen, of taking a hiatus. So that sounds familiar. Years later, Owen traveled on a safari with his son to Tanzania, where he shot some great scenes, but was often disappointed with the sharpness of the images. He studied this after the fact and concluded that sharpness can essentially be problematic when using telephoto lenses. This led him to changes in kit and technique. He then created a presentation on the topic and gave it to the Evergreen Camera Club in 2019. The presentation that you'll see now is a revised and updated version. Owen encourages your questions during his program, and I think we're going to try something a little different than most times, but I would still like to start with all of our members to mute themselves. But if you want to just unmute yourself and ask questions, I think Owen is certainly open to that. We typically mute the room here, so we'll ask members in the audience here at Lone Tree Civic Center to hold up their hand, and then they will unmute the room camera and ask away. So I think this will work well. We'll give it a try. One thing to share with you, despite my best efforts to provide Owen a stipend for this program, he's doing this gratis for us. So on behalf of ARC Photo Club, thank you very much, Owen. It's a very thoughtful and generous gift. So we appreciate your generosity. And with that, I encourage Owen to begin his program. And Owen, the stage is yours, my friend. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dave. And I appreciate the introduction. I think you explained well where I'm coming from. I'm yet another camera enthusiast. I'm not a professional photographer, so this is the story of one man's journey and experiences. I'm trying to give you the presentation I wish I'd seen about 5 years ago. And as Dave mentioned, I'd prefer you ask questions as I go. I've structured this so that the more complicated or involved topics are towards the beginning. And I want to take my time. Usually there's people in the audience of varying levels of knowledge and experience. So I want to make sure that I reach as many people as well as I can. And then towards the later slides, they're more optional or examples that we can delve into. So if I have to rush through them or even not touch on them, we won't miss a lot. So again, I'd like to proceed at the pace that works for the audience. The other thing is the slides will be posted to your club website, and there is a bibliography. So if I mention URLs, there's links in the slides, and then there's links in the bibliography. All of that will be available to you. You don't have to be asking or writing things down. It'll be there for you. So let me go ahead and share my deck. I, along with a zillion other people, am an Ansel Adams fan. And he saw photography as a performing art. He was actually a pianist and made a career choice to be a photographer rather than a performer. But he considered photography to be a performing art that had a composition phase and then a performance phase. And yeah, in many ways, I try to emulate that. I do post-processing, but as Ansel and everybody else is going to tell you, whether you post-process or not, the key is in the image capture and getting it right the first time. And one of the things I've always admired about his work is the exquisite detail that he's captured. I remember once looking at an 8x10 photo and being very impressed by the details. I stuck my nose into it to examine it. And then looking at the caption, I found out that it was an 8x10 contact print. So I'm partial to very fine detailed landscape photography. And I aspire in my own work to achieve fine art once in a while. But part of accomplishing that is a high degree of detail in the image in order to achieve that artistic effect. And what I've realized, as Dave told you, is that telephoto lenses tend to push the limits of photography, photographic equipment and technique, and especially things like wildlife and sports and high levels of magnification. And as he mentioned, I came back from Tanzania. I had some composition. I have a bunch of compositions I'm quite proud of hanging up in a gallery in my basement, but too many of the shots were a little bit murky or not quite as sharp as I would have wished. And so I tried to figure out what was going on. And I should mention that I had bought a new camera body right before I went on the safari. I upgraded from a 16 megapixel crop frame camera to a 24 megapixel camera, which was a good thing. I'm really, really glad I didn't take the old camera. And I spent a lot of money on that too. But having bought that new camera, I then tried a variety of super telephoto lenses to replace my old 8400 lens, which is definitely not the highest quality. It was just obsolete technology basically. But the images I captured really weren't that much better, even though I was looking at modern lenses, and I was trying to figure out what was going on, what the issue was. I found a website which is called the DxO Mark website, and this link will take you to it, and it's also in the bibliography. And at that time, they had some very interesting information. What they would do is they would test different lenses on different camera bodies and tell you how sharp the lenses were. And I was fascinated to find how much variation there was in sharpness for my existing lens, depending on which body it was mounted on. And also, I got to thinking about how much sharper my photos might be if I upgraded both my body and got a new super telephoto lens. And what I basically found out is that a 24 megapixel full frame camera is about half again sharper than a 24 megapixel crop frame camera. And that makes sense when you think about it, because the crop frame actually captures less than half as much light. Its surface area is smaller. And the differential can be higher for telephoto lenses than for other lenses. And also the full frame 24 megapixel camera captures most of the detail in the light that's landing on it, whereas the 24 megapixel crop frame does not. Therefore, the signal to noise ratio is much better, and there's much more quality in those 24 megapixels. And that extra it basically doubles the ISO sensitivity or better, and that gives a lot of flexibility in shooting. But I also debated whether it would be worth it to move to full frame, in that there's less, the crop frame has innate magnification, and I was really looking for a lot of reach. And those telephoto lenses I was looking at had more reach on a crop frame camera. So would that be worth it? And the bottom line is I decided to upgrade my camera and replace a couple of my lenses. I kept my telephoto lens because I couldn't afford to buy a new one yet, but it worked a lot better. So how'd that go? Basically, what it said in the database is what I experienced. So this is no surprise that a full frame camera is sharper than a crop frame camera, but it quantifies it and it's a really large effect. And I'm really, really glad I bit the bullet and made this upgrade. It was painful at the time. It cost a lot of money. This may not seem too relevant to the members of the audience. If you already have a full frame camera, I may be preaching to the choir. If you have a crop frame camera or less than full frame format, you're going, well, I'd love to have a fancier camera, but I can't afford it. But what I will try to do tonight is explain the trade-offs that you're looking at depending on the equipment that you've got. So if you have, basically, if you have less than a full frame camera, I think it's difficult to get fine art quality photographs using a telephoto lens. The telephoto lens kind of pushes the limit of a lot of technical parameters. You can, but you have to be very careful about the parameters that you choose, and you need to have a good lens. But there's trade-offs in terms of the amount of overall magnification that's going to occur or that your equipment is capable of. And once you get into the full frame cameras, the finer detail, the more granular sensors with more pixels do capture more detail. And the more detail you can capture gives you more flexibility in enlargement and so forth. And if you're aware of this, you can optimize what you get out of whatever equipment you've got. And I found and I know that some of you are dealing with mid-size cameras too. So obviously this applies, there's great advantages to a mid-size camera in terms of sensor size, but you can accomplish a great deal and achieve high quality, large prints with a full frame camera. So that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. But what I did find is once I had sharper lenses and a camera that had less noise, I found that shutter speed was increasingly the limiting factor on sharpness. And I'll get into this in detail in a little bit. But I did experience some surprises. One of them is I found landscapes to be much more of an opportunity when shooting with a sharper kit. And it's a different style of photography, but even expansive landscapes, panoramic landscapes can be very beautiful with a telephoto lens, which I hadn't really experienced with a full frame camera, which I hadn't experienced with my prior frame, my prior camera. I found that this is not a telephoto lens, but I'm bringing this up for technical reasons. I swapped my wide angle lens on my crop frame camera for another wide angle lens, neither of which had image stabilization. And I was expecting much sharper detail based upon the stats, but I didn't get it. And so why was that? I also found I was having much more trouble with depth of field doing macro shots like shooting wildflowers and trying to understand why that was happening. I also found that I was in some cases shooting very sharp photographs with my obsolescent 8400 lens, and that was better than I expected. So there were a number of things I experienced that were different than I expected. I'll go into each of them, starting with the telephoto panoramas. So this was shot with the full frame body. And I have blown this up to 40 inches, and it's very, very sharp in detail. And the depth of field is really excellent. I can't really tell where the focus is. I believe I focused on the sand dunes. I usually focus at a sharp point in the first layer in a shot like this, kind of a third of the way into the depth of field. But I was very happy with the overall quality of this. And I like the look of the telephoto landscape. It's a little more compressed. It gives more equal treatment to each of the layers in the photograph. And I find it to be a refreshing contrast to the traditional Columbine towering over a 14,000-foot peak. I like them both, but I'd like to see more of these. The trick, of course, is to have everything within the depth of field. And there are obviously calculations about hyperfocal distance. But basically, if you're standing on a hill and you can't see anything closer than about 20 feet away or 40 feet away, and you focus maybe twice that far away, then everything is in focus. And even though we're using a telephoto lens, sorry, let me zoom back a sec. At 110 millimeters at f11, everything's sharp. And the reason is because we're focusing at distance and there's nothing in the foreground. So the depth of field is much greater when focused at a substantial distance. The other great thing about telephotos is you have so much reach. There's many more compositions to choose from when you're standing on a hillside facing out towards the horizon. Another thing I became a lot more conscious of was shutter speed, as I mentioned. I found it was increasingly the trade-off in the sharpness of my work. And so let's start from the beginning and take a look, revisit the rule of thumb for camera shake. And I'm pretty sure I read this in Ansel's books way back when I was in college. But the idea is that focal length magnifies the image, and therefore it magnifies vibration, handheld vibration. So the thing one needs to do is to increase shutter speed proportionately to the focal length to compensate for that vibration. And it's a simple ratio. It's a very old rule. I imagine it's over 100 years old. And so, and you're probably all familiar with this, but I'll just go over it quickly. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens, you shoot at a 1/50th of a second. For a 100 millimeter lens, 1/100th of a second. For 500, at a 500th of a second. However, this is an old rule and there's a lot of caveats to it, and you need to make adjustments depending on what you're trying to do. And in particular, you need to be cognizant of all forms of magnification, including cropping and print enlargement. Also, it tells you nothing about what shutter speed you need for subject blur. And this can really, at least it catches me unawares, because especially with image stabilization, camera shake can be very well controlled, but tiny variations or movements in the subject that aren't even apparent when I shoot the picture may become apparent when I blow the image up or I crop it in post-processing. And as I mentioned, optical image, image stabilization makes a big difference, whether it's physical, whether using a monopod or a beanbag, and also or optical stabilization, which are really, really desirable things. And you want to do those things, especially image stabilization. but it makes it harder to figure out what's really the right shutter speed to use. Now, this view graph is kind of busy and techy, but it does illustrate a lot of, I think, important points. One is there are big advantages to image stabilization. This blue line is the trade-off between shutter speed and blur with image stabilization. The results are way less. The red line is the trade-off using an old school camera without image stabilization. Now, with a modern telephoto lens, we're going to be using image stabilization for sure. And that's a really good thing, or at least we have that option there. I'll get back to that in a second, but typically that's what we're doing. And an interesting conclusion, this study, which is bibliography, looks at different kinds of photographers in terms of how steady their hands are. And this particular view graph is for people who are not particularly, they have shaky grips. They're below average in their stability of camera, of their grip. So in this scenario, about 2/3 of the photos using the rule of thumb without image stabilization were satisfactory, and about 1/3 were unsatisfactory. And I think that's really a pretty incredible number. I don't want really any of my photos to be unsatisfactory due to camera shake, or I want a very low ratio if I'm facing significant trade-offs. But part of the moral in the story is it depends who you are, where you should be sitting relative to the rule of thumb. If you have a shaky grip, and if you don't have image stabilization, you might want a faster shutter speed than the rule would suggest. On the other hand, with telephotos, you do have image stabilization. And in that case, it depends on a lot of things, what kind of adjustment you want to make, because different lenses have different amounts of image stabilization. And then it also depends on the circumstances, background vibration. Manufacturers only give you a vague guideline, like up to 4 stops. What does that mean? So you have to be adjusting for your own grip and also for the capabilities of your lens. And the bottom line is you need to experiment to find out what kind of adjustment you want to make to the rule of thumb to compensate for camera shake. And it also relates to how much you're going to enlarge the whole thing after the fact. And all of this gets back to capturing the image right. There's only so much you can do in post-processing. And if you want to do a really big enlargement, you want to really control the you really want to control the vibration and all the sources of blur as much as possible. And it's not only about camera blur. It's also about subject blur. So this little Hummer was shot at 400 millimeters. And with the normal lens being 50 millimeters, that's 8 times normal, or an 8x magnification. But this particular cropped image was cropped with a factor over a 3 times magnification, cropped 3.4 times magnification. So between the 8-fold magnification from the focal length and 3.4 magnification with the enlargement, this is like 27 times blown up over just a 50 millimeter lens and no cropping. And what I find is the tip of the beak's a little bit blurry, and there's a slight double image along the breast here. So even though I shot this at 1/1250th of a second, there was a little bit of subject blur, and it's not quite crisp. Now, I put this picture in my calendar. I like this composition. It reminds me of it has kind of an Autobahn look to me. So I think it's a nice picture. But my point here is that with high degrees of enlargement, very tiny amounts of subject blur can affect the quality of your photograph. And it can be deceptive. Now, if you have your tripod set up, you feel like, you've really got vibration under control. But again, that has nothing to do with subject blur. And if you're doing a lot of magnification, as in this picture, it gives you a false sense of security. The other thing to consider is if you're cropping, the amount of data that you're throwing away goes up exponentially. If you crop 100%, then you wind up throwing away. So you wind up using a quarter of the actual image. You wind up throwing away 3/4 of your information, of your pixels. This crop is a 3.4 times crop. So you're throwing away over 90% of your pixels here. And when you do that, you get a grainier kind of photograph, and being blown up more, all the little blemishes and irregularities are amplified, are much more visible, including the noise in the background. So although shutter speed is really important, obviously focusing is too. And I wanted to provide some just general pointers on focusing. One I strongly recommend, and I think all the professionals I know use back button autofocus. What this means is there's a separate button. You have your shutter button still on the top of your camera, but you have a different button for focusing with. And this is configurable on most cameras. Most cameras ship with the shutter button triggering focus. So you push down, it rapidly focuses and then shoots. So you need to look in your manual to figure out how to set this up to have separate buttons that do each of these things independently. The one reason to do this is that it helps to settle the image, to pre-focus so you can see what you're shooting at, to settle the image stabilization. And also what I like to do is focus and then focus again. So I'm hitting the focus button maybe multiple times before I hit the shutter button. Part of it is, as I said, so you can make sure you get a bead, so your focus point is settled on the right part of your subject. And not only does it, I also like to set it up so I have shutter release priority. The default with a lot of camera configurations is not to shoot if the image is not considered in focus. I like to pre-focus sometimes on something distant from the object or to the side of the object of interest or to the side of the subject, and then swing over and recompose. And when you do that, the focal point may not be in focus because it's hovering over the background because you've recomposed. But as long as you got the focus correct when you first push the focus button, you'll get a good shot. It's good to focus. It's important to focus on detail in the subject, especially that which the eye rivets on, which may be if the subject's eye, if the subject is a person or an animal or a statue. In landscape scenes, however, often you're going for depth of field. And so you want to shoot to the midpoint of the depth of field somewhere in the image. And this tends to be about a third of the way into the depth of field. It depends on the aperture and the focal length. It's not an exact, this is not an exact number. You can use a calculator to figure it out. But what I like to do is, in a layered landscape, to focus probably on the first ridge of mountains into the scene, which is often about a third of the way in. And you definitely want to have the horizon within the depth of field. The other point I would make is configure your camera so it shows in your preview where it was that it was focusing when it took the shot. Because I find often, I think I focused on the tennis player or the owl or whatever, but I find in truth I hit the background and it's slightly out of focus. This way you get immediate feedback and you can make adjustment, take another shot, and make sure you got it right.
Hey, Owen, this is Carl. Just a quick question before you continue. You're talking about image stabilization on lenses and such, and mixing that with tripods. And we've all heard probably that, you know, a lot of people suggest that you turn off image stabilization when your lens is on a tripod. Have you done any specific testing, or what's your thoughts on, what's your experience on using IS when the camera's on a tripod?
Manufacturers recommend against it, and so I don't do it. I turn it off. There are feedback loops that can be set up when using a tripod. So actually, I talk about using a tripod a little bit later in this presentation.
Sure.
But that's a time when the manufacturers recommend not to use it, and I do not. There,
thank you.
now, but that does remind me, another question though is, should I use image stabilization all the rest of the time when I'm not using a tripod?
Right.
And I am of the school, well, I think it may possibly depend on the equipment that you're using, especially like if you have an old lens, maybe image stabilization just doesn't work at that high, a really high shutter speed. And I do use high shutter speeds. I read an article where some Canon technical rep recommended against using image stabilization at high shutter speeds. I think it was above 800 or 1000. But my experience is I get razor sharp photos with the image stabilization turned on. And I don't want to mess with it, because if I turn it off, I'll forget I turned it off and I'll lose some pictures. And I may not notice it, especially if I have a fairly high shutter speed until too late. So, and I'd be interested if anybody in the audience has an opinion on that, because most of this is stuff I've researched and I can point you to bibliography, but I think there's debate on that issue. Does anybody want to say anything about that? Okay, I'll keep on going.
Thank you, though.
Sure. Autofocus fine tune. Special in single lens reflex cameras, there are separate sensors that do focusing from the actual sensor that captures the image. And there's adjustments that are made, but they're not always perfect. That is very fine tolerances. And then it also depends on the particular lens, model of lens, and also maybe even the copy of the lens. So it's possible to make adjustments for these things. You can do it in the camera body. And there are some lenses like Sigma, I think, actually lets you to make adjustments in the lens itself using an adapter, fancy adapter. These kind of adjustments can make a difference, and especially if you're trying to wring the most out of your camera and you don't want to, you know, and your lens, you don't want to go out and buy a new lens. This is worth trying, especially if you have an inexpensive telephoto lens or an old one like my 8400. It's more likely to make a difference than one of the newer models, but it could be of significant benefit to get sharp focus. And especially with a telephoto, I try to maximize the sharpness at full extension of the barrel. I use zoom lenses because I'm often shooting at full extension, trying to get maximum magnification. So a related issue, well, another aspect of focus is depth of field. And this is something that I ran across a few years ago that was kind of an eye-opener for me. But diffraction is an important factor in depth of field. And not all depth of field calculators take it into account. Diffraction is, I believe, a quantum mechanics effect that creeps in as you narrow the aperture of your lens. The effect is minimal when you're wide open, but starting around f8, it starts creeping in, and what it does is it increases the blurriness of a point of light. Basically, the photons bounce around more the narrower the aperture, and this decreases the depth of field as you batten down the aperture and make it narrower. So I always thought for a lot of my photography years that the narrower the aperture, the better for depth of field. But actually there are diminishing returns, because as you decrease your aperture, it makes everything across the lens less sharp. So you have two competing effects. And in particular, it makes the focal plane, the thing that you're focused on, less sharp. So it makes your whole narrower aperture tends to make your entire image less sharp, and you reach diminishing returns. And according to the article that I read, the real sharpness, the real world depth of field tends to peak around f16. So this is in terms of physical sharpness that could be measured empirically. However, subjectively, you might have a more pleasing effect if you're trying to achieve a uniform look of sharpness throughout the depth of field. Even though everything's not super sharp, it might be more satisfying because the further and nearer objects might seem more similar in their sharpness. So there is a trade-off there, but in terms of physics, a really, really narrow aperture is not a good idea if you're looking for sharpness. Another interesting aspect of this to me is that depth of field and sharpness depend upon how big the print is, how many dots per inch there are, how sharp the eyesight of the viewer is. And also, everybody has personal preferences as to how sharp of an effect they like. And I mentioned I'm the kind of guy who sticks his nose into an 8x10 print looking for detail. So there are many factors, and it's really hard to consider all these factors. However, if you're looking to do a large print, a big blow up, you might want to do some precise calculations and try to make as educated a guess as you can when you take your photograph, because if you don't, there are limits to how much you can blow it up. So there are depth of field calculators that take diffraction into account, and I've got them in the bibliography. I originally found this using a Mac app, or sorry, iOS app, and I found another one for Android. So they're both in the bibliography if you want to experiment with this. I should also mention there are different ways of upscaling images, increase the amount of pixels beyond what you actually photographed. And there's traditional techniques that do simple interpolation. In recent years, they've come out with artificial intelligence that can do this kind of thing. And I found it to be useful. And what I would point you to, at least the point of departure, is the super resolution feature of Photoshop. And I find that feature can blow up an image about 100% without it looking natural. I don't take my word for it, but I recommend that you give it a try, especially if you're doing a big enlargement. If you're doing something that's a number of feet long, and especially if you're printing something that's going to be more than that has less than 200 pixels per inch. 200 your pixels at 200 per inch is not going to be as long as you want. As long as your pixels are mapping at 200 per inch, you tend to have a pretty sharp image as long as you got it right with your capture. But if you're doing big time enlargements, you want to be careful about what technique you use for upscaling, and I found that to be useful. And there are other products out there that are probably better. I haven't looked at it in years, so I would encourage you to do that. But as a point of departure, I would suggest super resolution. A few more things about depth of field. I mentioned that I wasn't happy with my macro photography after I upgraded. This is counterintuitive. What happens is when you use a longer focal length, when you double your focal length, you also wind up with a decreased depth of field. And that's different from if you're using a crop frame camera, you're getting the effect as if you had taken a photo and then cropped it. And so your depth of field is based upon the focal length that you shoot at. But since a crop frame camera magnifies things, if you zoom in on the same basic composition with a crop frame camera and shoot it, you'll wind up at a shorter focal length, a third less focal length than if you shot with a full frame camera. And therefore you will have more depth of field. And this is a pretty substantial effect. And there's a companion effect that the closer you are, the more narrow the depth of field can get. So if you're shooting at close distances, this is even more noticeable. And I use an example here. If you're with full frame camera, 200 millimeters in f9, your depth of field is 0.3 of an inch if you're 4 feet away from the camera. And furthermore, if you focus on, say, the front of the camera, because you want to make sure the front's in focus, half of your depth of field is lost because it's invisible. It's in the foreground. It's not part of the flower. So if you do this kind of thing, you want to be focused about halfway into the flower, 1.5 tenths of an inch in. It is a kind of ridiculous figure, but it illustrates the difficulties with macro photography. And this is one of the cases where a really narrow aperture can help compensate, but there's a limit to what you can achieve with that. And these are circumstances where having a calculator can help you understand what you're dealing with. Excuse me. So what do you do about this? Step back, like if you're talking about a flower, step back or zoom back if you have the zoom lens. Then recompose and then crop to compensate. So if you say you zoom back to half the focal length, then shoot and then crop it 50% to come up with the same basic composition, the same perspective. And as I said, you need to really figure out where the middle of your depth of field is and be careful about focusing on that in these constrained situations. And if you have static scenes, obviously you can consider focus stacking. That's another case though, where you want to have precise control over the distance that you're focusing at, and maybe you want to do some calculations to figure out how many shots you need to take. This is a photo I took with my old obsolescent lens. I think it's tack sharp. I think it's a very sharp photo. Part of the reason is the full frame body really improves the sharpness of this lens. But the other thing is we're in the sweet spot of that lens, it turns out. Let me back up a sec. So I shot this at f11 and I magnified noticeably. f11 with that lens has at least good sharpness to it. Whereas if I had done it wide open, it would have been fair. It would have been substantially, these are absolute levels. So it would be like a third less sharp. So the moral of the story is know the sweet spots of your camera, or the sour spots as the case might be. And in that case, it really made sense to shoot at f11 just to get a sharper image at the focal plane. Now, sports photography is another example of tight trade-offs that we face with telephoto lenses. I'm a Roger Federer fan. It's kind of like Ansel Adams. I'm not the only one. But I have, in recent years, every time I've gone to see Roger, I have assumed that that might be the last time I would get a chance to photograph him. And unfortunately, I was right, even though this was shot back in 2019. There was COVID and he was injured, and he's no longer going to be, he's retired. He will no longer be playing. So I rented, I hadn't yet bought a replacement for my 8400 lens. So I rented one, and I'm really glad I did. And in hindsight, I wish I'd rented a better lens when I went to Africa, on top of buying the camera body that I did buy. I used the Sigma Sports. It has a good sharp lens. It's a real boat anchor, but it is a good lens. But I faced serious trade-offs. Now I used f9. Depth of field is a significant consideration because these people are moving around, and we want to pick up some detail from the background. So I could have maybe gotten away with a lower focal length, or a sorry, lower aperture, but I'm trying to use general settings, and I'm also not really sure of the distances I am from these players. Sometimes I'm moving around from seat to seat. You're shooting the guy at the other end of the stadium. So I think that's probably a reasonable aperture. And we're shooting at a 12/50th of a second, and there's still some motion blur. Now, often that's desirable for dramatic effect, to show that, to give a sense of motion. But what I'm trying to achieve here is to take a portrait of the man. So facial detail is critical. And even in sports, just regular sports photography, they tend to shoot quite quickly because the face is really critical anyhow. So there's a trade-off there, but I still wound up with an ISO of 1250, which is higher than you'd normally want for a portrait. But these are the kind of trade-offs that we look at in low light situations. This is the afternoon, and we're looking through a lens that has, a long lens that can't be popped open to f1.2 or something like that. So there's some hard decisions to be made, and I often make the decision to up the ISO and keep my shutter speed very high. This is another example. What I like to do is use program settings on my camera. So if I have to quickly go and take a photograph, if I have an opportunity coming up and my wife says, honey, grab your camera, I can just flick it to this setting and have some reasonable defaults. This Hummer was in our backyard, and I'm lucky to get it. It's just flying around some flowers in the garden. There's no syrup, there's no canned syrup to entice it to stay in one place. And so my default setting, at least at this point, was f8, which doesn't give me much depth of field for a shot like this, but at least it gives some. And I use auto ISO. I have been setting the shutter speed at 1/2000th of a second, and ISO max sensitivity at 3200. And so the way it came out was we bumped against the 3200 limit. I shot at a 1600th of a second. And I'm happy with the result. It's a high ISO, but I think the bird is really sharp. And I think that makes the picture to have the fine detail on the subject. The flowers are pretty sharp, but they're clearly not in the fully sharp depth of field. So the focus is literally on the hummingbird, although there's fine detail, and you can even see little hairs on the flowers. So in this case, I'm happy with the control over the subject blur, and the detail that's visible in the flowers. And I think in this case, the ISO was not harmful. I think the colors are clean looking. I don't see any mottled effects. The edges are really clean. So it's dangerous going up that high with ISO, but I think one can achieve a fine art kind of effect with that kind of ISO under some circumstances. So this is a trade-off, but this is a canned configuration I used when I was in a hurry, and it worked out okay. And that's really the main point that I would make. So I mentioned tripods. We talked about tripods 45 minutes ago. when I shoot with a tripod, and it's usually landscapes for me, and and therefore static subjects, I use live mode on my DSLR camera. If you have a mirrorless camera, this is what you're doing all the time. This is using a DSLR, basically it's a mirrorless camera. Focusing can be very, very sharp in this mode as long as it doesn't have to happen quickly, which is, you know, again, true in a static landscapey situation. And one can manage the focus remotely. And this is still my old lens. And, you know, I think this is pretty sharp. They're actually, I don't really see subject blur here, but I was reading some equations, and this may not be quite as fast of a shutter speed as you want to avoid subject blur when you're shooting the moon. Maybe it should be 3/4 of a second. But I would again point out that when one crops heavily, it throws away most of the pixels. And this is a 7x crop that we're looking at here. This is my old lens at 400 millimeters. So we're looking at only 2% of the pixels that the camera body took. So again, that's a very serious trade-off to consider. And this is one of the situations where having a camera with more pixels would be very, very helpful, having 36 or 48 megapixels. Okay, so to recap everything, blurriness could be the kiss of death for a photograph, but also we should be thinking ahead when we shoot the image of how much we might want to magnify the image, including post-processing, including cropping and post-processing, which we just saw on the previous slide, can be pretty ruthless for certain kinds of subjects. So even though it's a pretty moon and it's in focus and all that, to crop down so to that kind of image where we're just showing the detail of the subject that's far away, we're throwing away a lot of pixels, and it limits the quality of the image that we share with our audience. And so crop frame cameras, by definition, crop the image and magnify. And then it makes a big difference about how big we intend to blow up the image. And we need to think about that beforehand. And those calculators that I mentioned let you allow for that to consider how big you want to blow up the image and make adjustments accordingly. And I think I've made this point a number of times. Subject blur, I find, is often the limiting factor for a really sharp image. So I haven't had a lot of questions. Do you have some questions now?
Yeah, I had one question. My name's Dan, by the way. What body exactly are you using?
I'm using a D750.
Okay, because the other thing I was going to say is, have you considered switching to a mirrorless full frame? Mostly because of the fact, like, one of the things I found was the limiting factor that helped is ever since I switched to mirrorless cameras have two shutter systems. One is the normal one, and one is the electronic one. And a lot of times the electronic one is very helpful because there's literally no noise, no vibration, no nothing. You know, the little bit of vibration sometimes can make a difference. So I was just curious about that. And I have a D750. In fact, that is my full frame body right now. Same thing. So I don't know if you had considered that.
Well, I like I know that mirrorless cameras are the wave of the present, much less the wave of the future. Nikon has said that they're not going to continue developing single lens reflex cameras. However, I think the D750 captures really really excellent images, and I'm not seeing much blur at the limits of magnification for the pixels that the camera captures. So it's not perfect, but it's a huge improvement over the body I had before. And I find that for moderately sized images, measuring up to 3 feet or more, that I can produce very sharp results without mirrorless. I have no doubt my next camera body, when I decide it's worth it, will be mirrorless.
Yeah, that's also one other question. What size, like in general, what size do you normally enlarge things to?
Okay, I don't actually enlarge things that often. I did a print of that sand dunes picture at 40 inches, and I was very pleased with the sharpness that resulted from that. But a lot of the time, like I put out a calendar every year, and it's a foot by a foot. So I do a lot of 12-inch long images. So I don't do a lot of enlargements, but I'm just pointing out that if you wish to do enlargements, you need to think ahead.
Right. Thank you very much.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, with that fine-tuned focus fixture that you showed, what distance do you place that from the camera and the lens? And say if you're testing a 300 millimeter or a 500 millimeter lens.
The trick is to get the image perpendicular to the camera. So you put it on a tripod and put the camera on a tripod is one way to do it. And at that point, it's a question of how far I can get away and still get a good beat on it and still get detail. That's not a very scientific answer, but 20 feet maybe. That's a relatively small target. If you're really concerned about optimizing for really distant targets, distant subjects, I would recommend getting a larger target.
What I typically do is I'm looking to have that focus test basically fill the entirety of the frame. And so obviously if you've got a 100 to 500, you need a long living room, you don't want to back up far enough to do that. But I think that works the best because you want to check it at all different focal lengths. Make sure that you don't have any variances in your focus from, an 80 mil up to the 600 mil or whatever. And just thanks, Owen, you've got a lot of really good points in there. I wanted to layer on top of that too, that if sharpness is your goal, your system is only as good as its weakest link. And a lot of times, especially with all of the kit type setups that are being sold today, people just coming into the hobby are, overlooking the criticality of lens quality. And you can go out and get your 36 megapixel full frame SLR and you stick a $300 or $400 or $500 kit lens on there, maybe it's a $180 kit lens, and you're never going to be able to achieve that sharpness that you're really looking for because your system is only as good as your weakest link. And I think a lot of people could do themselves a favor by going to their local camera shop and renting some of the higher end lenses and going out on the shoot and just shooting with a 180, 200, 500, $5,000 lens and look at the difference in results. And it's absolutely astonishing what good glass will do for sharpness layered on top of all the points that you made about camera settings and et cetera.
Very true. It's a long journey. I mean, it's expensive to get a full kit of full frame equipment. But it's for those who are buying, it's good to know that you can buy a full frame lens and use it on your crop frame camera if you can't afford to go the whole route initially. And you do get that advantage of extended magnification. So that might be a key part of your strategy for moving forward over the course of time.
I think the other thing to consider too, this isn't as talked about as much in the SLR world as it is in the medium format world, but the actual pixel size has a huge impact on sharpness and resolution when you get into the medium format world. And there's certainly schools of thought out there that certain micrometer pixels produce better results based on, you know, whether you're in a studio environment or an outdoor environment than other setups. And if sharpness is your ultimate goal, you could certainly go down a rabbit hole there in terms of the gear to try to achieve that.
Well, I'm not familiar. I haven't seen any data on mid-frame, mid-sized cameras, but I think my impression is basically there's a certain amount of photons given sensor size coming in. And so when you start splitting the information up into smaller pixels and it's the same surface area, then you magnify diffraction effects and you have less data, you have more noise. Your signal to noise ratio isn't as good. The more expensive setups, obviously, if you're getting a camera with a more sensitive sensor with more pixels in it, there'll be higher quality electronics and so forth that'll compensate somewhat for that effect. But I think that's why we don't see ever increasing amounts of pixels on full frame cameras, for example. We're kind of at limits of physics or practical physics up around 48 megapixels.
So Owen, this is Dave. I'm going to ask you to maybe stop sharing your screen. I think, you know, we'll probably go to the Hollywood version of Hollywood Squares.
Sure.
Be a little easier for people to see you and vice versa. So.
Dave, I just sent him the same thing in the chat. So
we're thinking on parallel tracks, Carl.
I do want to point out there is a bibliography. So if you want any of those links, have a look.
So the bibliography was your final slide of your presentation.
That's right.
Okay. Well, I'm encouraged that it seemed like everybody saved questions for the end. So, you know, that was wonderful, but certainly appreciate you sharing all your research with us tonight. I didn't mean to cut off anybody's questions. If anybody in the room has questions or follow-up questions, or anybody on Zoom. So
I'm just going to go spend some time on the DxO website, researching all that lenses on.
Yeah, I hope I made it clear though, they no longer have those combinations of lenses and cameras that they used to. That was the really cool thing about the site, that
Right.
they would measure the sharpness of the lens on different camera bodies. And it was really impressive how much difference there was. And it helped me understand what it would mean to get a different body or a different lens. But they don't do that anymore because I presume it just costs too much to do all those combinations.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Well, I'm a Fuji shooter, so I'm APS-C all the way.
Automatically modified.
Nation still available?
On DxO software.
Owen,
Hard to
Yes.
know.
no, I just have one other question, or possibility of something to talk about. I've been using Topaz Sharpen AI, and even on pictures that already seem really sharp, you know, within reason, it really does help. I don't know if you've ever tried any of those things, and maybe even tried it like on some of your images that you thought were not as sharp as you would have liked them to, and just to see. It doesn't always work, but a lot of times it does. And I'm just curious if you ever tried any of that.
I did experiment with it. I've also experimented, you know, since I already pay for Photoshop with super resolution. And as I acknowledged, I'm sure that's not the sharpest tool in the shed, as it were. But yeah, yeah, You can sharpen. Sometimes it's helpful just to sharpen an image, even if you're not blowing it up. Experiment with it. There are limits, though. I find that after about 100%, the tools I've tried, the times I've tried, it becomes more and more problematic. But yeah, I think that could be a very helpful tool, especially when sharpness is of concern.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, somebody who uses the Topaz tools a lot is Matt Koskla. He's got a channel on YouTube, of course, his website, mattk.com. But he's a big Photoshop and Lightroom guy, has been for years, and been doing tutorials for eons. He was also part of the Summit, which last week, if any of you took advantage of education there. But Matt Plaskowski, he's done a series of, he just recently did a bird photography using long telephotos, and he's got a couple of videos on his YouTube channel about, he's well impressed with it, let me tell you.
Any more questions? Well, thanks for letting me join you.
And thank you. Thanks. It was a great presentation, man. I mean,
Yes, thank you very much. I just one quick thing before Dave wraps it up. Owen, you're going to produce a PDF from that deck that you had and then send it off to me?
I did.
Okay. All right. Because that's what I'll post up.
I
on the
sent out,
website.
that's the one I sent yesterday. But I can retransmit if you have, if you can't find it, just let me know.
Okay, because I haven't gotten it yet. So what
Really?
email did you send it to? Yeah.
Oh,
This is
I'll
Carl
just send.
speaking, by the way.
Oh, this
Did you
is
send it to Dave or?
Dave. Yeah,
Okay.
but I can.
All right.
I mean, I'll send it. This is. Are
If
you the one
if
who
you
sent
could-
out you sent the invite out?
I sent the invite out. Yes. Yeah. So you can just reply to that, or
I'll do that.
you can use. Okay. All right. Cool. Because yeah, then I can get it posted tomorrow, and everybody can get access to the PDF and the bibliography and all the links that you have and all the information you have in there.
Cool.
Thank you.
Well, Owen, thanks for sending that to Carl. That's one less thing for me to do tomorrow to remember to do that. So thank you very much. But, thank you very much for sharing your presentation. It's always beneficial for us to have that under our member resources tab for people to, because you threw a lot of information at us. And so it helped to know that I didn't have to be scribbling like mad to make notes. So that's very much appreciated. So, but you've shared a lot of information with us. You've shared a lot of your research with us. So we're very, very grateful for that. And thank you very much for joining us. Wish you safe travels in California, and hopefully get out there with your camera and come out with some stunning images.
You bet.
So, all right. And for all the members and guests that have joined us tonight, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. So
You're welcome.
Anybody has any further questions or comments, I think we're going to draw this to conclusion. But Owen, thank you once again.
Okay. Sure.
Yes. Thank you very
Go ahead.
much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'll drop off.